Right, yeah, Philip Clifford's the name, Phil Clifford, or you. Most things work when you call me. I'm not a miner, never been a miner. I come from a family of miners, but I'm no expert on mining, so if you've got any questions on mining per se, don't ask me. I'm sure there's a lot more knowledgeable people in the audience. Can we just have a quick show of hands of any ex-miners we've got here, please? Look at that, all that expertise, brilliant. Respect to you all, thank you. My interest in mines rescue started when I was a young man, and there was a bit of family lore floating around where my mother told me, we've got a member of the family who's the dreaded heir of the mines. Now as a youngster, having watched John Wayne and in Hellfighters as Chance Buckman pretending to be dreaded heir, I was taken by that. And it's been a lifelong search for information. In the early days, very unsuccessful because there wasn't much available. Of late, of course, the advent of the internet, life's got an awful lot easier. So, I'm going to try and share some of the information I've got with you. Hopefully it's news to you. If it isn't, then just throw something at me. But hey, we'll see how we go. Right, I'll just throw a few statistics around. You probably know these better than I do anyway, but in the famous book, Great Pit Disasters by Helen and Baron Duckham, he lists principal mining disasters. I'll just punch them all up. And interestingly, I didn't realise that prior to 1850, there's no record of names of miners killed in disasters. Unless it was mentioned in newspapers of the day, there's no official record. So records only really started in the Victorian era, and the stats show that his stats show, and I'll explain that in a moment, that the average death per incident in that period was 70, which is horrendous if you think about it. Between 1900 and 1966, it got worse. It was 86.9, with fewer incidents, but of course there's a lot more miners. That just confirms what we said, that no proper returns of fatal mining accidents were made before 1851. Robert Peel wrote a book in 1894, and that was a bit of an eye-opener to me as well, because you think of mine disasters, you think of death, you think of all the horrendous that goes with it. But in actual fact, something like 76% of the deaths in mines were nothing to do with explosions or fire. They were falls of roof, the sides, shaft accidents, deaths on the surface, just as many on as opposed to miscellaneous underground, miscellaneous surface. It was a very, very dangerous occupation. I'm sure you all appreciate that, so I won't go into that too much. But the problem that was identified very early on, of course, is that disasters caused death, but it wasn't the fire or the explosion that caused the majority of deaths. It was asphyxiation. So many cases of miners being found looking perfectly healthy, just a strange colour, and they just died from afterdamp, or the effects of afterdamp. This threw up the issue that if we wanted to get any rescue going properly, then people needed to breathe in the tunnels underground, and the rescuers needed to be able to breathe while they were working and recovering. And the worst disasters, I'm sure you're all aware of these. The big one for Wales was Sengenith in 1913, 439, worst one in the UK. Barnsley, Oaks, of course. I've seen a lot of stuff downstairs in the Heritage Centre about the Oaks disaster in 1866, 361 deaths. Scotland didn't escape. Blantyre, 1877, 207 deaths. And the one that everybody, I'll say remembers, we don't remember, but we've learned about it. Not so many deaths, but it was such an horrendous incident, was the New Hartley in 1862, when the only shaft was blocked by a broken beam and all the miners in there perished through asphyxiation. So What was needed was breathing apparatus. It was about, there was efforts, you see that, it's not a very good picture I'm afraid, but that's taken from a Magic Lantern slide. This Frenchman called Galibert designed this goatskin bag full of air, 2 pipes from it leading to a mouthpiece. And believe it or not, to breathe in he had to block the exhale pipe with his tongue, and to breathe out he had to swap his tongue over to the other pipe. As you can probably imagine, that wasn't a great success. But that was 1859, so it was recognised very early on that something was needed. It wasn't in 1918 to 24 that it was looked at properly. I've thrown that in. The timeline doesn't always follow on this, and I apologise for that because there's various reasons, but I need to mention this now that the authorities got to look at rescue equipment, breathing apparatus in earnest in 1918. It took them until 1924 to produce a third and final report. That report didn't recommend breathing apparatus of any particular type, but it recommended a set of standards that all breathing apparatus used must meet before they'd be allowed down the pits. So that left the door open for several types of breathing apparatus in that time. The first chap to come along with a potentially working breathing apparatus, a rebreather, was Professor Theodore Schwann. You look in all the books, he's down as Belgium, but he wasn't, he was actually German, but he launched this in Belgium. In 1853, he had an apparatus designed which he said would work, but they couldn't afford to build it because it was the equipment and the chemicals that you need to cleanse the air from the exhaled air was too expensive. So it wasn't in 1878 he produced another version employing compressed oxygen and CO2 absorbent, which was probably the first proper breathing apparatus that we came to know. So arguably he was the first, but in actual fact, from our perspective in this country, this chap was the first. Henry Elwood Fluce, despite the name, he was born in Britain. His father was from Saxony, but he was born in Britain. He worked for C.B. Gorman. I'm sure you're familiar with C.B. Gorman, the manufacturer of breathing apparatus. He was a master diver. In 1878, the same sort of time as Schwann, he produced a patent for his rebreather. Looks like something out of Doctor Who, but the picture on the left is his original design equipment in 1878, and he poses in the picture on the right in 1880 with apparatus that he and some colleagues did use at Seaham in 1881. Seaham, as you recall, was a pit disaster that occurred in 1880, and they were attempting to reopen the Magdalen seam, and he used his equipment to go down there and see what they could do. It worked, didn't actually save any lives obviously, but it wasn't particularly in demand. The big issue with breathing apparatus is that probably the majority of mine owners and colliery managers in the country were very sceptical of breathing apparatus. They felt it was a waste of money to have it sitting there in the corner, never used. Come the day you need it, it wouldn't work. And to a degree, I think they were probably right. That's the picture of Fluce with his team that went into Seaham Colliery. And there's some familiarity now with what you all know as the proto gear. This was the early stage of that. This guy isn't local, but Robert Henry Davis was an inventor, designer, eventually managing director of C.B. Gorman, and he befriended Fluce when he joined the company. And he saw the potential of that design, and the two of them set to work on it and develop it and refine it, and they came up with the proto 1918 version derived from the flute apparatus, and it was marketed as proto brackets Fluce Davis design, so there was always a reference there to the original designer Henry Fluce, which I think was quite good of him. It was manufactured by C.B. Gorman & Co, but again there wasn't a great take-up of it. But then we come a bit closer to home. I'll move away from breathing apparatus for a minute. William Edward Garforth was first off agent and then managing director of Pope and Pearson Collieries at Altoffs, Normanton, which is a few miles north of here, I believe. He doesn't get mentioned very much. In fact, it took me a long time to find any information about him, even on the internet. Doesn't seem to be an approved biography of him, which is a shame because he was a real innovator and a pioneer. 1897, he presented a paper to the Institute of Mining Engineers, which was titled Suggested Rules for the Recovery of Coal Mines After Explosions. He wrote this document following an explosion at his own pit in 1866. He was deeply moved by that. He was a caring manager. He looked after his staff as best he could. He was as mercenary as many. He was in there for the money, obviously, as pit owners were and pit own managers. But in examining what went wrong with his own coal mine, he developed these rules. It doesn't show on here, but there's a strap line at the bottom of the page that says that these rules should be able to be read in 10 minutes so that rescuers can read them while they're sitting in the van on the way to a disaster. It took a long time for that to establish it. He produced it in book form eventually in the 1900s. But alongside his experiments to find out what was causing the problems, he developed Training Gallery. Now, we're going to talk about Barnsley and the Birdwell training station in a moment, which is acknowledged as the first mine rescue training centre. In reality, it is, but it was only the first combined station. As early as 1901, Garforth were developing trial galleries to train his own staff how to use breathing apparatus and how to rescue people. These pictures are later than 1901, but you get the idea. There's very little available to show you what it was at the time. He presented papers to the Institute, and eventually he got round to developing his own breathing apparatus. He tried several brought in from abroad, mainly from Germany and Austria, totally dissatisfied because none of them were reliable enough. So he set to with his own staff and he developed the WEG apparatus, W.E. Garforth. Looks hellishly uncomfortable, but it worked, and it didn't survive very long because there were better out there. But he spent a lot of time on it, as well as he was the first to prove that coal dust was an explosive in its own right. Now, to most of us that's fairly obvious now. At the time, he could not convince his peers that coal dust could be the cause of an explosion. This picture, which I borrowed from Brian Fraser's book, West Riding Miners and Sir William Garforth, it's a bit grainy, but it's a picture of a load of old boilers that were welded together to form a pit gallery, and they were sealed, filled with coal dust, and as I understand it, at the appropriate juncture he fired a cannon in there which shook up the coal dust, set it off. The blast ruptured the tanks. The blast was so loud it broke every pane of glass in the village, which he obviously put right himself for obvious reasons. But that was quite innovative, and it was after this experiment that people began to realise that he was right, that coal dust was one of the biggest problems, not just methane gas. But then closer to home, the more important guy in my opinion is George Blake Walker. George Blake Walker was son of a mine owner. He was equally concerned about his staff. He was a pioneer. He spent a lot of time in Germany. In fact, he served an apprenticeship in Germany where he was much impressed with their breathing apparatus. In fact, in Austria, very early on, it was mandatory that they would have breathing apparatus at all pits. He brought that idea back to the UK and started trying to develop it for his own pit, mainly Warncliffe Silkstone. He took the Austrian shamrock equipment, which is the one on the left, sometimes known as a Giersberg. And he was so impressed with what they were doing in Austria that he decided to develop his own. So he started a company, MECO. You've probably all heard of the mining engineering company of Sheffield, otherwise known as MECO. And he developed the shamrock into the one on the right, which is the MECO, which was quite successful. He also developed quite a lot of innovative equipment, coal cutting he introduced. And one of his early introductions was pithead baths. But believe it or not, he had trouble at the time trying to persuade colliers to use them. They were so set in their ways, wanting to go home to the tin bath in the kitchen. They took a long time to establish. His greatest innovation was, obviously, Birdwell Station. Birdwell Station, known as Tankersley Station, but it is definitely in Birdwell, as you all know. It's often reported that it was the first station in 1902. Well, it was actually constructed in 1902. Didn't start working as a proper station until 1903. That's a then and now situation. The picture on the right I took this morning in the pouring rain, so I'm sorry for the grainy picture of it, but you can see there's not a lot changed. The interesting thing is the timeline that went through getting that built, because it was first suggested that we had mine rescue stations in 1896 by Royal Commission. It wasn't until June 1901 that three directors of collieries, George Blake Walker, Matthew Habershon from Newton Chambers, and a Mr. R. Richardson, I can't find his first name anywhere, it's got to be out there somewhere, who was at the Barrow Hematite Steel Company. And they got together and they agreed they were going to build this station at a cost of £500 each, which seemed incredibly cheap, a lot of money at the time. They leased a plot of land from the Earl Fitzwilliam for 99 years, and the design of the station was built in such a way that if the need for it disappeared, it could be turned into two cottages. It's quite prophetic, because at the moment it's actually a nail bar and a cafe, but it's definitely split into two. So it did have a use after mine rescue. They also discussed beforehand how they were going to run it, because it wasn't a resident station. There weren't mine rescue engineers staying there, just a caretaker, and they decided they wanted a caretaker who was either a retired man or an ex-army man, and that's exactly what they got. And in January 1903 they appointed Sergeant Arthur Thomas Wimborne, and he became genuinely the first superintendent of a combined rescue station in the UK. No sooner they appointed him and they sent him to the Shamrock Colliery in Westphalia, Germany, because he didn't know anything about breathing apparatus. So they sent him out there to learn, which is what he did. He was instructed in the use of the Shamrock and the Giersberg equipment, and came back to the UK with that knowledge and with some of the equipment, and started training miners from neighbouring pits in the use of breathing apparatus. Genuinely the seat of all mines rescue operations in the country, even though William Garforth had started training his own men earlier by a year or so. Garforth, incidentally, was involved with George Blake Walker in discussions to plan this site, so they did work together, those two. The first experiments in that station in the smoke-filled atmosphere weren't until 1905, believe it or not. Excuse me. Another picture from this morning. The rain eased for a bit. Now I don't know, I'm no expert. I've got no plans for this site, but I'm assuming that that's part of what was the training gallery. Perhaps some of the miners here might know different. Be pleased to be corrected if I'm wrong on that. It's now a mother and toddler group room, so I couldn't take many pictures inside for obvious reasons. But it's nice to see that the building is still being used. The whole site is a listed building with Historic England, incidentally. More pictures. We've got one of the outbuildings, which clearly was a garage at one stage. And with grateful thanks to Google Earth, you can see the whole site from above, with the yard behind. Another shot there. With Aldi opposite now. I understand eventually cottages were built over the road where Aldi now is to house the then resident rescue engineers that joined the team when it became a resident station. Just leaping timelines again for a moment, because obviously Barnsley also benefited from another rescue station in 1913. This is all I can find. There are no photographs of it. I've scoured the British newspaper archives. I've even spoke to the people downstairs in the Heritage and the archives to see if they've got any photographs of it. Apparently it was built on Falcon Street off Eastgate in 1913. It's quite an impressive building. I believe it closed in 1986, and it must have been demolished very quickly thereafter. Shame, but impressive building. So back to Birdwell, Tankersley Station. I'll come on to the men in a moment, but the big event which put Mines Rescue firmly on the map nationally was a fire at Hampstead Colliery in Birmingham in 1908. The fire started on the 4th of March. The rescue teams weren't called until the 5th. Wasn't in their area, but there was no argument, no hesitation. They were asked to go, they went. And the teams that went, there was a team went from Altofts, sent by Garforth, and there was a team sent from Tankersley. I'll link to the next picture, which was similar to the one that was shown when you came in. They're the Tankersley team, and this is where we come across Walter Clifford, Joseph Outram, second, Sergeant Arthur Wimborne seated, and John Henry Thorne on the right, proudly displaying the canary in a cage, and by then their breathing apparatus, which was developed from the Geersberg. Excuse me. Just to clarify one point, Sergeant Arthur Wimborne wasn't a sergeant. He was demobbed at Colchester in 1903 as a corporal. I think the sergeant tag was added because it gave a level of authority, which is what they were looking for somebody that got the important role of manning a training programme. It's not trying to disparage him in any way, shape or form. He went on to great things, but he was only a corporal when he left. I don't think they're entitled to use the title corporal when they leave anyway. The apparatus, the Draeger, made by the German company in Lübeck, that is from their catalogue. That's what it looks like, naked so to speak. Quite cumbersome, lots of bits and pieces hanging off. But that's what the team went with to Hampstead. Unfortunately, in their rush to get there, they didn't take all the equipment with them. So once they'd used these breathing apparatus, they couldn't recharge them. They had to send the cylinders off to a local firm in Birmingham to get them recharged. And because they had German fittings and not British fittings, they could only recharge them half. So that cut down the amount of time that they were able to spend down the mine. But both teams, from Altofts and from Tankersley, gripped the nation with what they were trying to do. 1908, newspapers were common, everybody had newspapers, and it was, if there'd been social media at the time, it would have filled social media, as you can appreciate. Everybody was watching what was happening, everybody was expecting rescue to be effected. Clearly it didn't. It became a recovery operation. This is an after shot of the heroes of Hampstead, because not only were Tankersley and Altoft's teams involved, local miners were involved, local mine managers, and afterwards they all gathered for this group shot. Impressive picture. You can see in the back row, second, third and fourth from the left of the Tankersley team. Guy kneeling at the front looking at the miner's lamp is one of the chaps from Altoft's. Can't mention Altoft's and Hampstead without mentioning John Wellesby, who was one of their team members, who, using their WEG apparatus, but sadly he perished in the mine. Transpired at the inquiry afterwards that it turned out he was overworked, he hadn't slept much properly, and he got a bit of a cold, and basically that was a recipe for disaster. And he was just overcome, ran out of air, and his comrades had to leave him behind or they would perish themselves. But he was recovered by one of the Tankersley team later. His colleagues erected a very impressive memorial in St Mary Magdalene Churchyard in Altoft's. And this is where the awards come in. Edward medals were issued for the Tankersley team and the Altoft team. The Edward medal is not very impressive. I've got a little one here. If you want to look at that, you're welcome to. I can pass it round. It's actually not genuine, so don't get excited. If it was genuine, it'd probably be worth about £10,000 now. This is a cheap £7.50 replica from eBay, just for photographic purposes. Not very big, but very important, because in reality, as would happen later on, this is the equivalent of a George Cross. And in 1971, all living holders of this medal were invited to exchange it for a George Cross, and they were then allowed to use the post-nominal GC after their name. So that puts it into context of how important this medal was. These guys were incredibly brave. Without fear or favour, they kept trying to get into this mine, which was burning like blazes. And in the end, as I say, it was just a recovery operation. The other medal on the right-hand side is actually Walter Clifford's medal, forward and reverse. That's currently held at the National Coal Mining Museum in Wakefield, Cap House Colliery. These were struck in gold and issued technically as first class. They were equally minted in silver as well. And I've learnt tonight from a colleague over there now, I've learnt that there were some bronze, but I don't know who had them. I had a strange record from years ago from a Canadian publication called The Entombed, which talked about bronze awards as well, but no mention of who got them, and I've no other record at all until I was told tonight that a gentleman over there's got one. No name on it, unfortunately, but that fills in a gap which I wasn't aware of, so I'm very grateful for that. Clifford, Thorne and Outram looking like ducks out of water, all dressed up, nowhere to go, so to speak, but that was on a postcard taken as they prepared to go down to London for the investiture with the King to be awarded their medals. Walter's bowler hat does not fit, I have to say, but there you go. It's interesting as well to learn that at the time it was genuinely believed that bearing a moustache would help you breathe. Absolute rubbish, but they got impressive moustaches, especially Walter. And whenever you see a picture of him, it's always got this massive moustache. So coming to the teams proper. back to Wimborne. You'll see he's got EM after his name. He did get an Edward Medal, but not for Hampstead, because at Hampstead, of course, he was the conductor, the trainer, the instigator, the manager, the controller of the team that went down. Very important role, but he only got the gold medal for that. He didn't get the Edward Medal. A lot of people say he was a Yorkshireman. He wasn't. He was born in Lamberhurst in Kent. As a youngster, he was a plumber, believe it or not. But he attested to the 3rd Dragoon Guards in 1892 and served in India, demobilised in 1903 at Colchester Barracks, whereupon he was appointed instructor and caretaker at Birdwell on the 5th of January. And as I said earlier, he was sent straight to Westphalia to learn about self-contained breathing apparatus in the April of 1903. And obviously, till he got back, nothing much was happening at Birdwell Station. He didn't last there very long, because in 1910 he was headhunted. This was quite a thing at the time. Birdwell had a big reputation. They got some very important people, very brave people, got a reputation for their work, and Wimborne was persuaded to go to Crumlin in South Wales and take up the position of superintendent and trainer there, which he did. He resigned in 1910, went to Crumlin. He took Drager, not to take him with him, but he took the principal with him, and they issued Drager equipment to the staff down there in Crumlin. And the picture on the right there is him standing in the centre. Drager equipment as used at the St Kenneth disaster in 1913, with which he was involved. He was also personally involved in a rescue at Markham Colliery at New Tredegar, 1912, and that's what he got the Edward Medal for. They managed to rescue a guy from a pit. I can't find out why he was down the pit and not at the top directing, but down the pit he was, and rewarded for that he was, quite rightly too. He wrote a couple of textbooks, he wrote various institute papers, and he even lodged a patent in 1913 for an innovation on the breathing apparatus with regard to injection of air. For some reason he lodged that in the USA. I can't find any record in the GB office. But he stayed at Crumlin, and he retired in around about 1940, not 100% sure when, but he died in 1963, so he had a good innings, a good career, and he trained an awful lot of people. So that's Arthur Wimborne. John Henry Thorne, interesting chap. He was obviously with Walter and James Outram at Hampstead. He was a colliery deputy at Warncliffe Silkstone when he was trained at the Birdwell station by Wimborne. They were all volunteers, obviously, but he became proficient with breathing apparatus. So much so that after Hampstead he left and he went to work for George Blake Walker at Meco. And he was employed at Meco in Sheffield as, believe it or not, I've got it written here, a rock drill and rescue apparatus demonstrator. So he was a company demonstrator. Having said that, in 1910, you see him on the picture on the right hand side, him and his colleague James Littlewood, who were second from the left kneeling and third from the left kneeling respectively, they went to the Wellington Colliery disaster with their Meco equipment. Despite the fact they weren't colliers anymore, they weren't working for any of the collieries, they took their equipment and they excelled themselves at the Wellington Colliery, so much so that they were awarded the Edward Medal. John Henry Thorne got a bar to his, one of only two people ever to get awarded twice, the same medal twice. And on the picture on the left you can see the bar on his ribbon. Again, still looks fairly insignificant as a medal, but it's very, very important, and he was immensely proud of having been given it twice. James Littlewood in the centre at the front got one first time, and and excuse me, refer for notes. I'm of an age where if I don't read it, I'll forget it. John Henry went back with Miko after Wellington, doing his demonstrating. And one project he got involved with was Miko putting a tender in for the new mines rescue station at Porth in the Rhondda Valley, which was being built at the time. And they were tendering for breathing apparatus. He attended to demonstrate, did such a good job that they placed the biggest order ever for Miko equipment, but at the same time they poached him, headhunted him from the business. So he went to the Rhondda Valley and he became the superintendent of the, I can't remember if it's Rhondda Fach or not, but the Porth Rescue Station. He was there for a few years till he retired. This picture's interesting because it shows John Henry Thorne on the right at the back standing. On the left at the back standing is his brother, Harry. Harry Thorne followed his brother into mines rescue. A bit of nepotism perhaps, I'm not quite sure. But he went in nonetheless, and he became assistant to John Henry, but then eventually became the superintendent at Abercynon Mines Rescue Station. Harry sadly died from heart failure in 1921. He wasn't on duty at the time. It was just one of those things. What's even sadder is John had another brother, Edward, who became superintendent at Birmingham Mines Rescue Station in South Wales. And he died in a training accident in the Duchy Colliery in 1917, just before the war. And that was a disaster in itself. He'd taken a team of guys into an old disused section of a pit, the Duchy Colliery. One of the chaps became distressed. He went in to rescue him, and he succumbed as well. So two guys died in that pit, John being one of them. The inquest identified that the problem was the breathing apparatus. At the time, it was not delivering sufficient oxygen regenerated for him to work under stress. He could have carried on walking down a pit for 2 hours, breathing normally, no problem at all. But the minute he became under stress, heavy stress, trying to pick a guy up, trying to help him, he ran out of air and sadly died. So John Henry saw two brothers die. All three of them, including John Henry, eventually were buried in Tankersley, incidentally. But John Henry carried on his own. So then we come back to Walter Clifford, Edward Medal, my great-granduncle. We still haven't got a ready day yet, incidentally, but we will do. Walter Clifford was a coal miner from a very early age, working at the Woollerton pit in southwest Nottingham, and he was put out of work. He not to be outdone, he couldn't get a job in a mine, so he became a cotton warper in one of the lace factories in Stapleford, near Nottingham. But he had three brothers, all who worked in Barnsley. Billy, they were one of them, John. I was talking to Peter earlier about this. He was, I think, a deputy at Stratford Colliery. And they persuaded Walter, who by now got married and had a son, to move up to Barnsley, which he did. And he got a job at Rob Royd Colliery as an electric signal fitter. I'm not quite sure what his qualifications were for that, but he did it, and he did it for a while. And whilst there, he volunteered when the station at Birdwell was opened to be trained in using breathing apparatus. He became proficient in using the Draeger alongside John Henry. Was involved in the Hampstead rescue. He was treated like royalty after that. On his way back from London, having received his medal, he was diverted to Nottingham because he was the first Nottingham-born and bred boy to win an Edward medal. And they treated him like God. They wined and dined him, feted him, they carried him in open coats through the streets of Nottingham. These people were really famous in their day, and justly so, because you've got to bear in mind, of course, that it was early days of mines rescue. There were no rule books as such, other than the drafts that Garforth had written, but they were making it up as they go along. I'm producing a book that should be launched next year. I've only been writing it for 30 years, but I'm getting there. And it talks about a particular disaster that Walter was involved with. He didn't go down this particular pit, but I've got a third-person account of a disaster that nearly became a disaster, with the team being stuck in the shaft. It's quite a moving story. It'll be in the books. It's too long for me to relay now. But as I say, they were making it up as they went along, and they were learning as they went along. After Hampstead, Walter was headhunted. Whilst at Birdwell, they hosted various visits from various places. Lancashire and Cheshire colliery owners came along to see what they were doing in Birdwell, went away, and in 1908 they built their own very impressive mines rescue station at Wath, which was much, much bigger than what Barnsley had got at the time. They also hosted the North Staffordshire Colliery Owners Association visit, who were impressed with what they saw, impressed with who they met, and they persuaded Walter, who by now had become superintendent after Arthur Wimborne had left. He was only superintendent for a year, and he was headhunted to go to Stoke-on-Trent. By now, Walter had got a bigger family. That's a photograph is handwritten on the back by his later daughter Mabel, and is supposedly outside his house at Ratton Row in Dodworth. Walter on the left, obviously. Agnes, his wife, with a very impressive haircut, I must say. Standing at the back is eldest son Edward, who didn't become a miner, and at the front seated is his youngest son Arthur Bernard. That was taken in 1904. By 1911, Walter had gone to Staffordshire. In Staffordshire, he set up the mines rescue station from scratch, with very little equipment and staff, from 1911 until his death in 1923. And he was involved in 10 disasters during that, significant disasters during that time. There's only 9 bars. I'll come to the 10th one in a minute. And North Staffordshire Colliery Owners Association issued all their rescue team members with the Staffordshire Knot medal. And if you've been involved in a rescue, you were given a bar to it, and you can see them all on there. Birchamwood, 1911 through Jamage, Hensford, Norton, Silverdale, Crackley, Mini Pit 1915, Newham Heath 1915, and the Mini Pit again in 1918. The 10th disaster that's not shown was at Apedale in 1923. In April 1923, he was involved at Apedale with his team, directing operations, and he was taken ill. So he was rushed away, and sadly he died following December from cancer. He was buried in an unmarked grave at Hartshill Cemetery in Stoke-on-Trent. Sad end, but that medal is also held by the National Coal Mining Museum at Wakefield. And the other Tankersley team member we haven't spoken about yet, right button again, we're all right. Joseph Outram. Don't know very much about him. I can't find very much about him, other than the fact that through the internet I've since learned he was attested to the 7th Dragoon Guards in 1885 and served in India. He became a deputy at Hoyle Common from 1901, maybe slightly before that, I'm not sure. And he volunteered to be trained in mine rescue and distinguished himself, as with the others, in 1908. He only got a second class medal, Edward Medal, don't know why. But interesting, had he lived long enough to 71, he would have swapped that for a George Cross, which didn't have a first and second class standard. He actually enlisted in World War II, but for about 3 months, and then he was discharged. I don't know why. It could be his age, could be his reserved occupation. But he continued in the World War as a sergeant major in the Home Defence Corps, very well respected. But he committed suicide in 1924. Again, nobody knows why, there's no record. Archives don't hold the inquest. But that was a tragic end for what was clearly a brave man. He'd been through the Dragoon Guards, he'd been through Hampstead. He was willing to serve in World War II, but he decided to take his own life.
Would he be World War I? Yeah.
No, Dragoon Guards was before World War One.
Yeah, you're saying he died in 24, so he can't have served in the Second World War.
Oh, I beg your pardon. See, I've mistyped it, haven't I? I do apologise. Yes, thank you. I'm glad somebody's watching. I'll change that the first opportunity I get. But that's all I know about him, unfortunately. Tragic end. He's buried at Hoyland Cemetery, again in an unmarked grave, which is tragic. But got to mention the Altos rescue team. Very few pictures about. This is taken from Staffordshire Sentinel in 1908. Ignore number 1 because that's John Thorne, we've already spoken about. The reason he's on there is because these 4 were pictured just before they went for their investiture at the palace to get their medals on a different day to when some of the others went. So ignoring number 1, number 2 is James Hopwood, number 3 James Cranswick, number 4 is James Whittingham. John Wellesby, the one who perished from Altoft, he also got the Edward Medal posthumously, and his wife got an annuity, which was quite considerable. I think it was about £262 she was awarded in a purse, which is a lot of money by the standards of the day. But that showed the respect that they got for him. So those are the other 3. I say apologies for the grainy picture on that, but blame the Staffordshire Sentinel. Right, now we come on to the Rated Air connection. Arthur Bernard Clifford, Dodworth born and bred. The only one that in my family that was. Born at Ratton Row. He excelled at school. He earned a county minor scholarship to Barnsley Grammar. Apparently he passed an examination for the Lock and Kerrisworth scholarships, which I don't know anything about, but he declined it in favour of the county minor scholarship. I don't know why he would have done that. Maybe somebody locally will throw some light on that one for me. Of course, in 1911, Dad moved to Stoke-on-Trent, so he obviously went with them, where he continued his education at the North Staffordshire Technical College. And in 1912, aged only 18, he became assistant to his father at the North Staffs Mines Rescue Station. And the only picture I can find of the 2 together is that one. Straight out of a newspaper again, unfortunately. That's Talcott Hill Rescue Brigade, circa 1913. Walter wearing his medals, and 19-year-old son Arthur next to him. The team now are wearing Proto, which was the standard equipment that was used in Stoke-on-Trent from the onset. Arthur, while he was an assistant, 19, 20-year-old. He did very well. He helped out. He was involved with Jamage, Norton, Silverdale and Crackley, 1911 through to 1914. And he got his Staffordshire knot with 5 bars. But in 1914, there's a big gap before the last one at the mini pit, 1918. And this is genuinely where we cue the Red Adair at the moment. Does everybody know who Red Adair was, by the way? I'm talking about him, but I'm sure you've all seen the film with John Wayne in it. Red Adair ran an American company, and yes, his post-war, he set up a company travelling the world, just extinguishing oil well fires and oil well blowouts. His last endeavours before he died were in Kuwait after the Iraqi invasion, because when they retreated, as you know, they destroyed all the wells, and he went in there. But anyway, that's by the by. This is what got me going in looking into this family history a bit. Potrero del Llano in Mexico, October 1914. That is one hell of a fire. I can't go into all the detail because it's massive, but that fire ultimately covered 40 acres. It was a huge blowout, one of the biggest oil wells discoveries at the time. And they were struggling because you were literally wading knee deep in crude oil to try and get to the wellhead to try and capture it and stop it. All the while the Mexican Revolution was on, of course. You've got to bear that in mind. There was bullets whizzing all over the place as well. Arthur was approached and asked to go to Mexico, which he did. In October 1914, he arrived at Potrero del Llano. Arthur is in the shirt sleeves on the right, and he's on the right-hand side on the left-hand picture, wearing his proto equipment. And he worked there for the best part of 6 months, primarily training local staff, local employees, local natives, as he calls them, to wear the proto equipment. But he was developing it on the hoof. It was still very much in its infancy, you've got to bear in mind, in 1914. It was the Mark I proto, even, if you like. And it suffered because crude oil is a horrible chemical, and it dissolves rubber and it makes a hell of a mess of the equipment. So they were designing face masks and hoods and all sorts of things so that they could get into that fire and extinguish it. He wasn't actually involved at the death of the fire, but he trained a lot of people there to get into it. The reason he wasn't there was in early 1915 he approached the owners, and it was owned by a British company. The El Aguila Oil Company was owned by Pearson's of London, civil engineering company, and they wanted to be released from their contract because Europe was at war and they wanted to get back post-haste to join up. Very patriotic. He was asked to stay on and train some more people at Vera Cruz until they were ready, which he did. But in 1915, he got passage back to Liverpool, went home, and he thought, hell with this, it's been a hard slog for 6 months, I'm going to have a couple of weeks rest. Who can blame him? Which he did. Now this is where it gets really interesting, because I'm going to try and read this. This is his own words. Arthur standing at the back on the left in uniform, as you can see there, May 1915. He wrote, "Towards the end of April, I presented myself at the local recruiting office and joined the county regiment, the 5th North Staffords. I was instructed to proceed to the depot 2 days later. The same evening, however, I was asked by telegram if I would consent to go to France immediately to train men of the tunnelling companies in the use of breathing apparatus and to supervise military mine rescue work in France. I naturally wired an acceptance, and the next morning left by early train from Stoke-on-Trent, arriving in London just before midday. Enlisted at Whitehall as a sapper in the Royal Engineers. Proceeded to Chatham for soldier's kit. Left Chatham the same evening for Southampton, and arrived at Le Havre at 8 a.m. the next morning. Having received certain instruction at Chatham, I found the railway station and joined a truckload of London clay kickers who had been sent over a few days previously. And after an infinitely wearying and tiring journey, there being 42 men with full kit and rations in one cattle truck, nice, arrived 2 days later at Balliol, where I reported myself to the then Major John Norton Griffiths at the headquarters of 172 Tunnelling Company, Royal Engineers. So, he spent 6 months in Mexico, up to his knees in oil. He comes home, takes a couple of weeks holiday, and within 3 or 4 days he's in France, in uniform, as a Lance Corporal. Considered himself a civilian in uniform, as you would do in those circumstances. But for the next 6 months or so, he was solely responsible for training mainly officers, but also sappers, in the use of the proto equipment, which is still in its infancy, don't forget. You can see some of the guys there wearing it. It was a monumental task. And he was moved eventually to school in Armentières, which became the Second Army Proto School, colloquially known. Conditions were good. He was able, using tables and chairs, to simulate galleries. Bearing in mind that obviously the people who were training were tunnelling under German lines. But apparently the army headquarters was close by. So they were, not surprisingly, bombed every day, shelled every day. So it was decided to move them. The army being the army, did everything properly. They went and built a mines rescue school. There's the standard army huts. This was on the Western Front in France, and this had everything. If you've ever watched Dad's Army episode where they were doing gas training in an army hut, this is the sort of thing that they were doing there for real. The map's not very good, I'm afraid, but if you look just below the top, you'll see a crosshairs against a straight line. That's where the Mines Rescue School is, actually in Belgium. The dotted line is the border between France and Belgium. The castellated line on the right, looks like a snake, is actually the front line. And in the top right-hand corner, you'll see it says Hill 60, which I'm sure you're familiar with, where mining operations were going on. Follow the castellated line down, and you'll see some black dots every so often. Each of those black dots was a trench mines rescue school. They were set up. The station was set up at every trench where they were digging tunnels, with equipment stationed there, proto equipment, and an officer was designated to maintain that equipment and keep it in good order. And one of Arthur's jobs was to travel that line on a weekly basis, checking that the equipment was in working order and ready for use. Got a few good pictures here from the C.B. Gorman archive. That is a Second Army Mines Rescue School. I don't know whether they're officers or sappers, I can't really tell, but they're all set ready to go into a dummy training mine, which is that picture. You can see them coming out. I say dummy, the fact it was photographs, I can't believe it was at the front line, so I'm assuming it was just one of their training galleries. But Arthur was heavily involved in training all these guys until more help came from predominantly Staffordshire, the Midlands. Trained rescue staff were sent out to France. Trained miners were sent out to dig the tunnels. Trained rescue staff were sent out to look after the proto school. So Arthur did get some help in the end. But overall, he was expected to train about 3,000 men in the use of proto equipment. And that went on until 1918. And we're back to it where you remember his medal. There was a gap between 14 and 18. In July 17, there was the big bang at the Western Front. Messines Ridge was blown up. 19 mines detonated simultaneously. by the army. It was the first offensive success that the army had had for the duration of the war up to that point, really. But it meant that the army was mobile again, moving forward, which meant tunnelling operations ceased, which meant Arthur was a little bit redundant. But back in January 18, Walter was involved with rescue teams at the mini pit, Podmore Hall, which had gone up with a big bang. And it was a huge disaster with fire, and it was taking up all the resources they had. Walter was required back at Stoke-on-Trent because they couldn't leave the station without a superintendent. So the military recalled Arthur from the Western Front and said, come back, take over from your dad, which he did. Next picture we need, he's actually sitting there in uniform in the middle. This is the Midland Coal Coking Iron Company rescue team in 1819. He worked on that project with those teams for 20 months. So probably a world record for the amount of time it took to recover that mine and recover all the bodies that were down there. About 155 miners were killed in that incident. At the end of it, in 2021, he was still working with his father, but he decided he wanted to make a name for himself elsewhere, and he transferred to the Forest of Dean, who had opened up a new school, Mines Rescue School, at Cinderford, in the Forest of Dean, Gloucestershire. And that's where he went. He wrote a book, instruction manual for use of oil rescue men. It was published 3 times because it changed so rapidly with all the innovations of technology. And the medal on the right is his 10-year award for service with Forest of Dean. That medal is held by the Dean Heritage Centre at the moment. It took me a long time to find that, but it's held there along with his 5-bar Staffordshire Knot medal, which you saw earlier. And after 20 years of searching, quite out of the blue, these medals turned up. Chap contacted me. The chap that contacted me through the internet, he was the son of a guy called John James, who was Arthur's assistant at Cinderford. John James was long dead, but his wife lived on in Crumlin, and when she died, her son went in to clear the house and found these medals. He said, they're obviously not his, they're all named to Clifford. Would you like them? Oh, yes, please. So he sent them to me free of charge, and I got them framed and mounted. The medal on the right at the top is the Meritorious Service Medal, which he was awarded after 2 years' service for his efforts at the Western Front by the military. That's me nearly done. We talked about all these people, and the one thing they got in common, it all started here, Birdwell. It's a good picture, shows the garage at the back, and I think Barnsley, for me, I'm sure you'll agree, is at the centre of coal mining in the UK. Even though it may have lost that mantle through tonnage produced, this is where it all started, something to be proud of. And I'm hoping that Barnsley Civic Society or Civic Trust will help me get a blue plaque on that building before too long. It is listed, as I say, but it deserves more recognition. Thank you for listening.